Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take rich source material articles, research, or in this case, a really profound biblical text, and we try to distill the timeless lessons. We want to give you, clarity and context for thoughtful engagement. And today, we're setting aside the headlines, the economics, the latest tech trends. Our stage is set very firmly in first-century Galilee, specifically that strategic town of Capernaum.
It's an excellent place to focus our attention, I think, especially for those of us who really appreciate a deep, careful study. This whole deep dive is dedicated entirely to one very specific and I think very potent encounter.
Right.
The Roman Centurion in Capernaum. We find it detailed for us primarily in Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 7.
And our goal it's not just historical awareness, is it?
No, not at all. It's really about spiritual clarification. We want to understand in depth the nature of the faith that prompted Jesus himself to marvel and, how that informs our own trust today.
That's the core of our mission for this deep dive. I mean, we're analyzing this narrative to discover what it practically means for us to emulate the Centurion's model. How do we learn to bow low in humility, but at the same time ask boldly in expectation? And then ultimately trust fully in the absolute authority of Christ's word.
Yeah.
We're treating this material with, I hope, the seriousness of a scholarly endeavor, but also grounding it in the warmth and the pastoral understanding needed for thoughtful adult Christians to apply grace to real-life decisions.
And to get that kind of depth, we need a clear structure. So we'll begin by really immersing ourselves in the historical setting. We'll look at both a centurion's context and his very unusual character.
Right.
Then we'll dissect the narrative itself, paying really close attention to that pivotal difference between the Matthew and Luke accounts, especially regarding his request.
Which is key.
It's absolutely key. And that will lead us naturally into the profound theological implications of his faith. And finally, we'll land on the actionable spiritual lessons that teach us how we can live now.
So let's start with that physical location, Capernaum. When we read the Gospel, sometimes these towns can feel like, like simple backdrops.
Like a movie set, almost.
Exactly. But the sources make it so clear that Capernaum was far more than just a sleepy fishing village.
Oh, absolutely. It was a bustling, critical hub. You have to picture it. It's situated on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was a major fishing port, yes, but it was also a key crossroads for trade routes.
It's a lot of traffic.
A ton of traffic. These routes linked the Mediterranean coast to Damascus and the interior. And because of all this commerce, it had a Roman presence. You had a customs office there.
Which is where Matthew, the tax collector, was called from.
That's the one. And significantly for our story, a Roman garrison.
Yeah.
So Jesus actually chooses Capernaum as his home base, his headquarters, after he leaves Nazareth. Matthew's gospel notes that.
And that's why so much of his public ministry, the early healings, the teaching in the synagogues, so much of it happened right there.
Precisely. The news of Jesus would have spread so rapidly because Capernaum was a center of traffic and communication. People were constantly coming and going. News traveled fast.
And right in the middle of this intensely Jewish town, a place where Jewish hope and national identity were so pronounced, we find this representative of the Roman Empire, the Centurion.
Yeah.
He wasn't just in Capernaum, he was the local face of the occupation.
He really was. And we should probably pause and define what a centurion was, because the title implies so much more than just being a captain.
It does.
He was an officer commanding roughly 100 men, and these guys were the absolute backbone of the Roman legion. They were career soldiers. You didn't just get this rank, you earned it.
Through what? Courage.
Through unparalleled courage, steadiness, combat skill. These are often highly decorated veterans who had survived dozens of campaigns. And crucially, they weren't just fighters, they were administrators.
Wow.
They were responsible for judicial matters, tax collection oversight, and most importantly, in a tense town like Capernaum, maintaining order. They carried this thing called a vitus. It was a vine staff, and it symbolized their absolute authority to discipline troops
Or civilians.
With immediate and often brutal severity.
So this man was a walking symbol of absolute authority, of discipline, and of foreign control. It makes the Jewish reaction to him incredibly predictable. They would have viewed him and everything he stood for with deep suspicion and profound resentment.
Absolutely. The tension was just. It was palpable. You have Israel, God's covenant people, under the boot heel of a Gentile superpower. The sources remind us that the overarching sentiment among pious Israelites was this desperate longing for national
You
deliverance.
see that theme everywhere.
It's all over the place. It's echoed in passages like in Luke's gospel. So when a Roman officer appeared, the typical reaction was never welcoming. It was hostility, it was bitterness, and it was prayer for his ultimate downfall.
And it's with that necessary context that the story of this specific centurion becomes such a complete reversal of expectations. I love the line in the source that says, Scripture refuses to flatten people into emblems.
Yes.
This man stands out as such a stark exception.
He is a theological anomaly. Luke preserves a detail that shows us his character before he ever even meets Jesus. He doesn't approach Jesus himself. He sends highly respected Jewish elders.
Which is a move in itself.
It's a huge move, and those elders, they don't just deliver his message, they commend him. They argue to Jesus that he is worthy of help because, and this is the quote, he loves our nation and has built our synagogue.
Let's just dwell on that for a moment, because that is extraordinary.
It really is.
A high-ranking Gentile officer, the very instrument of foreign occupation, has financially invested in and effectively built the local place of Jewish worship. That is a massive contradiction to the political reality of the day.
It's entirely countercultural, and it points to what historians often call a God-fearer. This was a Gentile who had moved past just intellectual curiosity about Judaism.
Correct. They were actively drawn to the monotheism and the moral framework of the God of Israel, even if they hadn't fully converted. His actions show his heart was already being softened.
He wasn't just tolerating their worship.
No, he was funding their spiritual infrastructure. He was demonstrating respect, affinity, and yes, a form of love for a nation that, by and large, generally hated him and what he represented.
So this pre-existing respect for Israel's God sets him apart. But he also demonstrates an equally rare character trait for his time, which is this deep compassion for those under his authority.
This is the second crucial layer of his character, and we have to remember the Roman system here. Servants, who were often slaves, were considered property. They were chenbal.
Expendable assets.
Completely expendable assets. They were often treated harshly, neglected, especially when they were ill. Yet the sources really highlight that this officer valued his servant highly. He was grieving over his pain.
Matthew's gospel describes the servant as lying at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. Right, so the centurion's response isn't detached administration. It's not, well, I need to replace this unit. It's urgent, it's compassionate, it's personal grief over someone who, by the societal standards of his day, had very little intrinsic value.
That is incredibly moving.
Yeah.
And it forces you to reflect on our own modern equivalents, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, who are the expendable people in our own sphere of influence? The overlooked, the marginalized, the people we are tasked with leading that we don't, move heaven and earth for.
That's a challenging question. It shows that his piety was practical. His respect for Israel's God translated directly into a radical love for human beings created in God's image, even those he legally owned.
So you have this combination: respect for Israel's faith, a love for Israel's people, and this deep compassion for an expendable servant. This all marks the man before he ever even sends messengers to Jesus.
Right.
So the theological observation is pretty clear here. Grace was already at work. It was preparing the ground for the seed of faith.
Precisely. This man's preparatory disposition, his humility, his readiness to look past his own status and tribal identity, it made him uniquely receptive to the revelation of Christ's authority. It lines up perfectly with what Jesus teaches later on, that no one can come to him unless the Father draws them.
And this isn't about works earning salvation.
Not at all. It's about a heart that has been turned outward by a divine influence, making him ready to recognize and submit to the true king when he encountered him.
His character is undeniable, but the greatest shock of this story really comes in how he approaches Jesus and what he asks for. So let's look closely at the narrative itself, especially since Matthew and Luke give us slightly different angles on the interaction.
And Matthew gives us the most direct, streamlined, almost punchy version. Matthew 8 just focuses immediately on the core dialogue. The centurion comes and pleads, Jesus offers to go, and then the centurion cuts him off with that famous declaration.
The focus is really on the quality of the faith.
Exactly. It ensures the focus is entirely on the immediate, immense quality of the faith being displayed.
Matthew's account feels like a snapshot. It's meant to emphasize the sudden miracle and the power of the word itself.
It is. But Luke, who is often the historical investigator of the Gospels, provides the procedural details that really enrich our understanding of the centurion's humility.
Right.
Luke reveals that the centurion was so acutely aware of the social and religious chasm between a Roman officer and a Jewish rabbi that he didn't even presume to approach Jesus directly.
He sends the Jewish elders first.
He sends the Jewish elders first, and they, ironically, try to leverage his good works, his synagogue building, his love for the nation, to convince Jesus.
So the first petition that Jesus hears, which is delivered by the elders, was based explicitly on merit and worthiness. It was, he deserves your help because of what he has done for us.
That's the important initial premise. The elders saw merit in his deeds, urging Jesus, this man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation. But this is where the narrative ground shifts entirely, and it's the pivotal moment that Luke captures so beautifully.
As Jesus gets near the house, the centurion sends a second message.
A second message, this time through friends. And it completely nullifies the elder's plea of worthiness.
He corrects them.
He completely corrects the whole theological framework. It's an astounding act of theological correction. The centurion sends word, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof.
And he goes even further.
He does. He says, that is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. He explicitly rejects the entire idea of meritocracy. He's saying, the elders think I'm worthy because of my gifts. I know I am utterly unworthy before the holiness of God.
So it's not, I need to earn your presence.
It's, I need your grace. That is the ultimate shift, moving the whole request from a position of, I earned this, to one of pure grace. He strips himself of all rank, all status before Jesus. It takes genuine humility to refute people who are actively praising you to your face.
That's a really good point. And he's also showing incredible cultural and religious sensitivity, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He's essentially saying, I know the rules of ritual purity, and I know who you are. To ask you to cross the threshold of my Gentile house, to defile yourself according to the law, that would be an offense. But you don't need to be defiled to heal my servant.
Wow.
That recognition is the gateway to his extraordinary faith. He recognized that all his earthly rank, all his military commendations, they meant nothing before the Lord of creation.
And this leads directly to the core insight of his faith, his stunning grasp of Christ's authority, which he explains through the metaphor of his own military life.
This is the intellectual genius of his faith. It's brilliant. He uses his own military structure as a perfect parable. He says, for I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it.
Okay, let's break down that analogy because it's so powerful. He understands that his power isn't inherent in him. It's not about his personal charisma or strength. It's delegated. It flows from the emperor down through the ranks. And when he speaks, the men obey, not because of who he is, but because of the structural authority backing his word.
Exactly. So the conclusion he draws from this is just breathtaking. He reasons that if his word, which is backed by a finite human emperor, has the power to compel men and determine movements,
then how much more potent must the word of Jesus be?
How much more potent must be the word of Jesus, who operates under and possesses the ultimate authority of heaven itself? He concludes that Christ's word rules sickness and health, life and death, just as certainly as his own word ruled his 100 men.
The crucial word then is say.
Say.
He rested everything, not on Jesus's touch or Jesus's presence or even Jesus's mood, but entirely on the power that is inherent in the mere speech of the Son. He recognized true spiritual authority at a distance.
That's the entire point. He needed Jesus to speak, not to step across the threshold, not to perform some physical ritual, and certainly not to prove himself with an immediate sign. And this is precisely why Jesus praises his faith above all others.
Because it honored his person.
It honored the Lord's person, his divine, inherent right to command, more than it just chased after a temporary therapeutic power.
And what was the Lord's reaction? It's one of the very few places in the Gospels where Jesus is described as marveling at someone's faith. And that word itself is a theological statement.
It's an astounding scene. Jesus literally stalks in his tracks, turns to the crowds following him and says, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith.
Think about the weight of that declaration.
It's staggering. In the heartland of the covenant people, where the temple stood and the prophets taught for centuries, the greatest living expression of faith that Jesus has encountered is found in a Roman Gentile, a man who understands structural, sovereign authority.
It's amazing. And the healing itself is almost It feels like an afterthought. Because the miracle of the faith displayed was somehow greater than the miracle of the servant's body.
It was. The centurion made his request. Jesus gave the command, or really just affirmed the faith, saying, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And Luke notes that the servant was healed at that very moment. The physical result just confirmed the centurion's theological conviction. The word was and is sufficient.
So the narrative sets the stage, but the theological significance is where this encounter really shifts our understanding of God's plan and the very nature of salvation itself.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at the four major truths this story pulls together, starting with the first one, the very definition of a pleasing faith.
Right. Truth one, the nature of pleasing faith. This centurion's faith provides such a powerful contrast to the type of belief that Jesus often encountered in Israel. So many people demanded sight or physical proximity or some immediate spectacular proof before they would trust.
They were looking for a sign to validate what they already sort of suspected.
Exactly. But this man, he trusted the word without the sign. He was living out that principle the Apostle Paul would articulate later. We live by faith, not by sight.
So what distinguishes his request from just a simple, desperate plea? I mean, lots of people were desperate.
The distinction is rooted in his understanding of authority and his posture of humility. He wasn't demanding a bargain. He wasn't saying, "If you heal my servant, then I will believe."
Right.
His faith was already resting on Christ's authority. He was saying, "I already believe you can command it, so just speak the word." He leaned his full weight on that authoritative word.
And his humility fits his faith perfectly.
It does. He calls Jesus Lord. He confesses his own unworthiness to even receive Jesus into his home, and then he just asks and rests. He makes no effort to coerce or bargain. So faith in this model is recognizing Christ's inherent lordship and then submitting our request entirely to his capacity and his authority.
And this takes us directly to the second truth, which is arguably the most radical point for a first-century audience, the widening reach of grace.
This is a massive theological pivot, and we can't just gloss over the shock value of what Jesus says next in Matthew 8. After praising the centurion, Jesus gives this stunning declaration. He says that many will come from the east and the west to feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom, while the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside.
For the Jewish audience of that day, that statement would have been explosive. I mean, their entire hope, rooted in the covenant, was that they were the exclusive inheritors of the table, and that the nations, the Gentiles, would either serve them or be judged.
Exactly. The common expectation was that the Messianic kingdom would reaffirm Jewish exclusivity and national prominence. And Jesus' statement, it doesn't cancel God's promises to Israel, but it expands their fulfillment in a way that nobody expected.
The centurion is the living proof.
He is the living, breathing foretaste of a communion table that is much larger than anyone anticipated. It actually confirms God's faithfulness to the prophets like Isaiah, who promised that the nations would one day stream to the light of the Lord.
So if the centurion is the first glint on the water, as the source puts it, how does this theme evolve later in the New Testament?
Well, he becomes the prototype for Gentile inclusion. Later, Paul explains that in Christ, that wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile is completely broken down. They are made one new humanity, reconciled to God through the cross.
So the centurion's faith proves that God's plan of salvation was never dependent solely on an ethnic bloodline.
Right. It was always dependent on trust in his son. Now, we have to balance this, as the source notes, by remembering that God's faithfulness to ethnic Israel remained sure in his own time and according to his own mysterious ways. Paul gets into that in Romans.
Sure.
But the point here in this moment is that faith, not heritage, is the entry requirement to the kingdom.
Okay, so if the centurion's faith is the right posture, the third truth is all about the object of that faith, the magnified authority of Christ.
Right. The centurion understood that Christ's power wasn't a magic trick. It was fundamental. It was structural. If Christ speaks, creation answers. This incident clearly affirms that Christ teaches with authority, he commands spirits, and he heals with a simple, sovereign word. We see that elsewhere too.
And the centurion's recognition of this points forward to the ultimate truth Christ would declare after his resurrection.
Yes, all authority in heaven and on earth will be placed in his hands.
So his faith affirmed Christ's pre-existing, non-delegated total authority over the entire physical realm, and that includes disease.
Yes, and that is why today the church opens the scriptures. We believe we hear him speak through the written word, and we obey. Not because we need more proof, but because we recognize that his word is life and that it carries the same creative and commanding authority as the word spoken over the centurion's servant.
He teaches us that the highest form of respect for Christ is to simply trust what he says.
The inherent power in his commands, yes.
And finally, the fourth truth. It's a sober warning that has to balance the joy of the Gentile welcome. And that is the danger of presumption.
This is the flip side of the coin. Jesus' words about subjects of the kingdom being thrown outside into the darkness, it's a stark, sober call to personal, demonstrated faith, not just inherited status.
Right.
Many people at the time felt they had a permanent seat at the table simply because they were descended from Abraham.
They were relying on tradition and heritage rather than a personal, current trust in the one who was right in front of them.
Precisely. Proximity to holy things, the temple, the synagogue, even being geographically near Jesus, it could not substitute for a love of the Holy One.
And we have to ask ourselves, what are the modern equivalents of that presumption?
That's the question. Is it relying on being raised in a Christian home, on having been baptized as an infant, on having ancestors who founded a church or were pillars of the community?
Right.
The centurion, an outsider, showed what true submission and trust actually looked like. Meanwhile, those who thought they were guaranteed insiders, just by birthright, were warned that entrance to the eternal table is purely by grace and faith alone. His faith shines a light on the requirements for everyone, emphasizing that the key is believing in the Lord, regardless of your lineage or your religious resume.
So this is where the centurion moves from being just a historical model to becoming an active instructor in our spiritual lives. His actions provide these incredibly powerful and actionable lessons for us today. Let's start with application number 1. Our posture in prayer.
The core lesson is so clear. Come low. The centurion was a man of immense worldly status, power, authority, yet he completely surrendered it before Jesus. He literally traded his status for surrender, declaring, "I do not deserve, but say the word."
In a modern culture that is constantly encouraging self-assertion, demanding that we know our worth and claim what is ours, this is a revolutionary posture.
It's completely countercultural. We often approach prayer like it's a business transaction, right? We list our qualifications, or we subtly remind God of what we've done for him lately.
The centurion reminds us that the way of blessing runs directly through humility.
That's the critical difference. We have to pray knowing that the Lord draws near to and does not despise a broken and contrite heart. Practically, this means when we approach the Lord with our complex, long-term issues, whether it's a family crisis, a vocational struggle, or seeking healing, our first step isn't to dictate the terms.
It's to acknowledge his greatness.
His greatness and our absolute dependence. We need to surrender the how and the when, trusting that the Lord's plan is sufficient, even if it differs from our immediate request.
And application 2 deals with how this humility then translates into action toward other people. The application is care for others.
This is a vital moral and relational lesson, especially for anyone in leadership or with any form of influence. The centurion grieved urgently over an ill servant. This was a person others in his culture would have considered easily replaceable property. He didn't just passively feel sorry for him, he took action. He risked social awkwardness and potentially professional judgment by seeking help from a controversial Jewish rabbi for his slave.
So the application is twofold. First, recognizing the inherent, non-negotiable value of every single person, especially the marginalized or the expendable, because they bear God's image. And second, seeking their good with active urgency and patience.
And the greatest kindness we can offer to those we lead or influence or just encounter is to bring their deepest needs under Christ's word. The centurion crossed social lines and sought the highest authority for his servant's temporal need. We have to be willing to cross socioeconomic, cultural, or relational barriers to bring others' needs to the feet of Jesus.
Because his authority covers all of it.
It covers all forms of human pain and need. The centurion's grief motivated his mission. Our compassion should motivate ours.
Application 3 focuses on our approach to receiving divine intervention, trusting the word over needing signs.
Yes. The centurion explicitly rejected the need for physical presence. He said, just say the word. He teaches us such a powerful lesson about resisting the modern, often consumeristic, hunger for immediate, visible signs when we already possess something far more permanent and foundational.
The Lord's written promises, the scriptures.
Exactly. We have the written word, which we affirm is breathed out by God and profitable for everything. Yet we so often still pray, show me a sign, God, just to be sure.
And that seeking of signs over sufficiency It actually undermines Christ's authority, doesn't it?
It does. It elevates our emotional or physical certainty above the revealed truth of God. We measure the quality of our faith not by the number of wonders we can collect and post about, but by how quickly and fully we trust what God has already said in the scriptures.
And this doesn't invalidate genuine answered prayer or miracles.
Of course not. God certainly still works wonders. But it sets the right order. Faith has to fasten first to the Lord's voice, resting in the authority of that voice. And only then should we receive whatever gifts or physical signs he chooses to send. The word is the foundation, not the optional add-on.
The fourth application addresses what is maybe the most difficult part of the spiritual life, that waiting period. How do we maintain steadiness in waiting?
It's so hard. Most of our heartfelt, long-term prayers reside in that in-between space. We've asked, we trust, but we haven't yet seen the visible change. The Centurion believed without visible, immediate proof until the word went forth, and only then did the change come. He models a faith that is anchored and patiently enduring.
So how do we anchor ourselves during that waiting period, especially when the silence seems deafening or the circumstances seem to get worse, not better?
We have to anchor it in the character of the one who speaks. The source reminds us that he is faithful to all he has promised, and importantly, he cannot deny himself. Our certainty isn't in our timeline or in our desired outcome, but in his immutability, his steadfast, unchanging faithfulness.
So some practical counsel here.
Two things, I think. First, we must keep bringing our requests to him, holding them up against the authority of his word. Don't stop asking. Second, we must keep standing under his word. By that, I mean we continue to live obediently and keep doing good while we wait. Steadiness comes from certainty in his character, which always transcends the immediate circumstances we can see.
And finally, application 5 connects the centurion's personal story back to the global picture, Christian mission.
Yes, this centurion is not just an individual. He is a living prophecy. When Jesus says that many will come from the east and the west, that's a direct, ongoing call to the church to lift its eyes to the nations. The promise that the Gentiles would come to the table is the fuel for the Great Commission.
So, in effect, the Great Commission going and making disciples of all nations is the feat put to this very preview.
Absolutely. The centurion modeled boundary-crossing faith. He, a Gentile, crossed cultural and political lines to ask a Jew for help. We, the church, must cross modern cultural, socioeconomic, and geographical lines for love's sake, extending that invitation everywhere.
The lesson is that God's grace reaches across every dividing barrier we erect.
Every single one, racial, economic, political. And that reality should instill both urgency and boldness in our global mission efforts. The kingdom is defined by faith, and that invitation is open to all who will receive it.
The story of the centurion in Capernaum, it really stands as one of the most compelling and instructive faith models in all of the Gospels.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a practical definition of extraordinary faith, we find it right here. Humble without being timid, bold without being proud, and completely clear-eyed about Christ's total authority. He just asked for a word, and the Lord answered.
This faith teaches us, really simply, to trade our earthly status for eternal surrender, and to trade the need for sight for the sufficiency of trust. Heaven still marvels when believers, regardless of their background, their heritage, their pedigree, when they look at the Son and rest completely in what he says.
It's a faith that honors Christ's person.
His person and his divine right to command, more than it just chases after signs of his power.
Let's return to the passage that really encapsulates the magnitude of this encounter. It reminds us of the promise that flowed from that day, recorded in Matthew chapter 8, verses 10 and 11.
When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven."
The encouragement flowing from this promise is just so profound. The invitation to God's eternal table still stands. And entrance is based not on bloodline, not on history, not on earned merit, but purely on believing the one whom God sent.
May you carry the posture of the centurion into every interaction and every decision you make today, low before Christ in humility, urgent for others in compassionate action, and certain that the Lord's word alone is sufficient for every situation, every healing, and every journey you face. Go and rest fully in his commanding authority.